In this lesson, we'll be discussing one of the most daunting question types for most GMAT test takers on the verbal reasoning section of the Focus Edition, and that's going to be the bold-faced statement critical reasoning style questions. So we'll begin by reacquainting ourselves with the argumentation equation because it is this that the bold-faced questions are ultimately asking you to evaluate. And we know that our premise is going to be the explicitly provided supporting objective facts, and you add to those premises an assumption or assumptions, which are going to be your unstated statements of fact that must be true to logically lead to the conclusion, which is ultimately your explicitly stated subjective opinion that was in need of some sort of logical support. Now, your bold-faced statement rules can ultimately only be two of these three items. First, they could be the premise or evidence or grounds or reasoning. Secondly, they can be a conclusion, but they needn't be a conclusion, actually, or argument, claim, or any of the other synonyms that you should hopefully recognize. But ultimately, the big thing to recognize is that your bold-faced roles cannot be explicitly stated assumptions because an assumption must always be implicit. So strategically, you want to read your bold-faced role prompt or at least skim it briskly just at the beginning of the process to determine if you can kind of see what's going on. Because if you cannot, this is going to be the primary task and honestly the primary format of question on the entire verbal reasoning section that you might decide to immediately guess and mark for return if you're behind pace after 1/3 of the section, after 2/3 of the section. Because we just know that these are ultimately going to be time consuming. So you have to be honest with yourself as you're working through it. And if you're a little bit behind pace, you might go, you know what? I'm just going to guess, see if I can determine what the conclusion is real quickly, and then flag it and move on, recognizing that the GMAT focus does give you that opportunity potentially to change up to 3 questions in the section. And we know that generally there will be at most 2 of these bold-faced style questions within any given verbal reasoning section. So let's talk about how we identify the argument roles. And you're going to pretty much assume that you're going to need to use the conclusion test to address these bold-faced role style questions. So first, eliminate from consideration any clearly objective statements of fact. Then you want to determine the number of possibly subjective statements in your prompt. If there's just one, that has to be your main conclusion. But if there are more than one possible opinions that could be your main conclusion, consider the direction of support and determine that the statement requiring support must be the main conclusion of the argument. So you want to think, does statement A support statement B or vice versa? And whichever statement requires support, that has to be your conclusion. Now, once again, strategically, the bold-faced argument structure should be assumed to be probably a little bit more complex than your average argument. It's not going to be like some of the more straightforward strength and weak and flaw questions that A, may tell you in the question stem what the conclusion is directly, or in the argument say things like therefore and clearly lead into the conclusion. And you also have to make sure that you don't assume that one of the bold-faced statements must be part of the conclusion. The conclusion actually can be entirely separate from the bold-faced statements. So you want to treat them the same as the other statements when you initially evaluate the argument by diagramming it. So let's take a look at a sample critical reasoning style problem, and we're going to just address the bold-faced statements. And we can immediately see that this is a bold-faced statement task without even reading the question stem, because in the prompt there's 2 bold statements. So as always, we read the question stem and it says, in the argument given, the 2 bold-faced portions play which of the following roles. But again, we probably didn't even need to necessarily do that. So we're going to ignore the bold-faced statements to start. And we're just going to start reading the prompt and writing out a simple diagram for notes. We're going to use the shorthand of P and a colon for premise and C and a colon for conclusion. So we start reading at the beginning. The art critic states, while traditional art derives much of its strength and eloquence from local sources, well, that's one of the bold statements, and this is clearly just a fact. So you can actually write out bold 1, and you may not even write what it says, because clearly that is the first statement. So bold 1, it might just be next to my P when we're taking notes on the actual exam. We then keep going. Most cultural funding programs have historically favored artists who come from somewhere else and have concentrated on delivering artistic resources or assets to communities from outside. So that next bit we can just shorthand as most CFPs, meaning cultural funding programs, favor outsider art. Simple enough. Then we keep going and we read certainly such approaches are not made with bad intent. So again, the second bold is just going to get categorized as another premise. So we just state outside approach okay, or just write once again bold 2 as being sufficient for taking that note. Then continuing to the end, we finally get to our conclusion, and it says, but their rigid application, meaning the approaches favoring artists from somewhere else, makes funders and policymakers blind to the artistic traditions that are of, by, and for a local community. So we'd have to shorthand this as rigid outsider approach is blind to the tradition of local art, and we would note that this is not one of our bold statements. So now that we've got our shorthand, we can go to our answer choices, but we only want to evaluate the choices one statement at a time. So we'll start with statement 1. And we can see in choice A, it says the first states the main conclusion, and we know that the main conclusion is actually not a bold at all, so we can eliminate choice A immediately. Then looking at choice B, the first articulates a state of affairs that is an exception to a rule. I mean, it's a state of affairs, so there's nothing to quibble with here. The first provides support for the argument's primary claim, maybe. I mean, it's support of something, it's premise. Choice D, though, the first is an assumption for which no evidence is provided. No, it's not an assumption, it's a statement, it's premise, so D is out immediately. And then lastly, choice E, the first provides evidence in support of the position. Again, maybe, it's premise. Then we move to evaluating the choices for statement 2 against the notes alone. So the second qualifies the main conclusion of the argument. Now, it's not the main conclusion, but it qualifies it. It's one of those terms that you might get caught up in. But choice B, again, maybe. We'll hold on to that. Now, choice C, however, the second is that claim. We know the second is not a claim. It's actually still more premise, so C can be eliminated for that reason. And then choice E, the second questions the validity of that position. It doesn't question the validity, it actually says the approaches are not made with bad intent. And if we go back into choice B, the first articulates a state of affairs that is an exception to a rule. Well, the exception is that traditional art derives much of its strength and eloquence from local sources, but the other side is going to be about the somewhere else. So that matches the first part of choice B. The second qualifies the main conclusion of the argument. So it's talking about the approaches that are ultimately kind of blind to the tradition of local art as not being made with bad intent. So now we've got that. And had we any other remaining choices, we'd confirm them against the argument as well to potentially eliminate. But choice B matches pretty well, and that would be the selection we would make. So our boldface statement process, you want to consider that the task here is constant. You don't really have to do much. You know that it's always going to be asking what are the roles of the boldface statements in the argument. And these are immediately identifiable, so they can help inform your strategy about whether or not you want to engage based on the pacing that you're experiencing during the section overall. Then step 2, you use the conclusion test to identify the conclusion, ignoring the bold statements, and then you just note the statements and the bold statements and the rest of the argument as either premise or opinion/conclusion. Then step 3, tacitly predict the roles of the boldface statements by their placement in the notes as either premises or an opinion/conclusion. And then step 4, evaluate the choices against the predicted roles in your diagram of the argument through the process of elimination, but only one boldface statement at a time. And you can stop evaluating the choices as soon as only one choice remains a possible match to avoid excess work. Kind of like we just saw in the previous example, we wouldn't have necessarily needed to parse choice B all that closely if we evaluated that at least half of the other answer choices were definitively wrong immediately. And again, that's a way to expedite your evaluation of this particular question task in the critical reasoning question formats for the verbal reasoning section. Now, let's head on over to the whiteboard and see how we'll execute our whiteboard process when you're doing these questions on your own and working through the verbal reasoning section. So as we're setting up the scratch pad here, we immediately know what the task is because we see the bold font. And so we're just going to write out bold roles immediately. And we know we need to have a spot for premise and a spot for conclusion. So reading at the beginning, the economist states, despite tremendous potential resulting from Brazil's natural endowments and untapped land. So this is kind of a contrary premise because of the despite. And so we'll just say despite here. And then the B potential, I'll put contrary to, so it's a sentence that actually makes sense. Then we get to the first bold, which is several important factors are likely to slow agricultural expansion. So are likely to slow, that's an opinion. And we could just write that bold one is definitively part of the conclusion. Whether it's the main conclusion or not will reveal itself momentarily. Then much of the country's available farmland is in areas that lack ready access to transportation infrastructure. Okay, so we know that the AF for available farmland lacks TI for transportation infrastructure, and that's just a fact. Meanwhile, increasing demands for transportation, storage, and port infrastructure and capacity will likely outpace supply for quite some time. Now, we might think that this is kind of an opinion as well. Despite continuing government efforts in this area, and we know that the government effort for transportation infrastructure continues. Now, we have to consider the direction of the logical support. Does the first statement support the second, or does the second support the first? And the factors being likely to slow agricultural expansion do not increase demands for transportation, storage, and port infrastructure, and capacity being outpacing the supply for quite some time. So we know that the second opinion leads to the first. So that means that bold 2 is ultimately still a bit of premise, even though it's kind of an opinion. It's not necessarily as definitively objective fact as the other pieces were. So now we'll just go one bold at a time. So we know that the first bold is the main conclusion. So choice A seems okay for now. We'll just put a squiggle for the first bold evaluation. The second choice, the first is evidence. Well, no, it's not evidence. It's our main conclusion. So B is out immediately. Choice C, the first is a subjective opinion, subjective position. Again, we'll leave that open. The first denies evidence. Well, it doesn't deny the evidence. I mean, it's not great. I'd hold it, but I'm probably leaning towards eliminating D. Now, choice E, however, we know that the first bold is not support for a claim. It is the claim itself, so we can eliminate choice E immediately. Now, all we have to do is evaluate bold 2 in conjunction with the remaining answer choices, meaning A, C, and D. So, choice A, the second is an opinion provided in support of that conclusion. Wow, that looks pretty good right now, considering our statements of opinion earlier. Then we skip to choice C because we don't have to evaluate B any longer. The second is the main conclusion. We know it is not, so C is out. And then choice D, the second is that conclusion. Once again, D is out. And our correct answer is A for all of the reasons that we've already kind of articulated. So when you're considering bold statement style questions in the verbal reasoning section, first decide whether your pacing allows you to engage with them. Second, carefully diagram the argument and then look for efficiencies and elimination to make it so that you can not only get these questions right, but do so in an efficient manner.